Alrighty, so we are ready to continue with our collection view. In the last lesson, we added our collection view. We have our recipes cell. It's all set up here in Storyboard. We've also created our recipescell.swift file, which is a subclass of a UI collection view cell. And we've gotten it ready to be displaying data. We are rounding the corners of our recipe image, and in our configure cell function, we are setting the image to the specific image that will be passed in as part of the recipe instance. So now we need to come into our recipes selectionvc.swift file, and we need to start implementing our protocols. Okay, so we need to use actually 3 protocols for our UI collection view. And 2 of them are similar to the table view. We say UI collection view delegate. All right, so this is the first one, UI collection view delegate. This is the protocol that defines methods that allow you to manage the selection and highlighting of items in a collection view and to perform actions on those items. The methods of this protocol are optional, okay? So I can implement this and you'll notice that we don't actually get any of those errors that say, hey, you're not conforming to this protocol, because all of them are optional. The next one is our data source. So UI collection view data source right here. And this says that an object that adopts this protocol is responsible for providing the data and views required by a collection view. A data source object represents your app's data model and vends information to the collection view as needed. Okay, so this is important. And we're going to address this a little bit more here in a second, but where it says here that the delegate, which is this view controller, vends information to the collection view as needed, okay? So before we were talking about protocols and delegates, kind of like it was just a one-way street, that the delegator sends information to the delegate and that's it. But a lot of times we are actually receiving information from the delegator if we are the delegate, and then we need to send back information as well, okay? So in this case, the collection view or the table view needs to know what kind of data to display. And so for instance, back in our home VC, that would be something like this, for instance, where we are informing the table view that each row should be 200 high. Or over here, in our cell for row at, we receive information from the table view. We get the index path, but we need to return to the table view a instance of a UI table view cell so that the table view can then display that. Okay, so just want to go ahead and make that distinction that protocol delegate communication isn't one way. A lot of times, we as the delegate also need to provide information back to the delegator. All right, so we need the data source, and then we need one more, and that is the UI collection delegate flow layout, okay? So UI collection view delegate flow layout. And this protocol defines methods that let you coordinate with a UI collection view flow layout object to implement a grid-based layout. The methods of this protocol define the size of items and the spacing between items in the grid, okay? So we are going to use this to set the size of our cells. And we need to conform to our protocols. So I'm going to go ahead and click here and say fix, because we need to add the methods that are required from our UI collection view data source. I'm going to say fix. And you'll notice that this is very similar to our table view required methods. We have number of items in section and cell for item at. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and cut these and drop these down below our view did load. I'm going to get rid of this print statement. All right, so before we forget, what should we do next? Let us set this view controller as the delegate. So I'm going to say collection view dot delegate is equal to self, and collection view dot data source is equal to self. Okay, so speaking of data source, we need to get some data for this view controller to vend, as they say, to the collection view so that it can display it. All right, so let's create a variable here. We're going to say var recipes, and this is going to be an array of type recipe. Okay, and we're going to implicitly unwrap that. We are also going to need our data set. So I'm going to say let data equal data set and initialize that. Now we can get from our data the recipes that we need for this particular category. So remember, from our home VC, we click on a cell and we pass a food category. Okay, let's open up our data set. So we are passing one of these food category instances, which has a title. Okay, and that is what we are passing, just the title. And then we're going to utilize, if you recall, this method down here, get recipes for category title, and then we pass in a string, which is one of these food category titles, and that returns whichever recipes array corresponds to that title. Okay, so if we click on burgers and we pass to the recipe selection VC for burgers, we're going to call get recipes and pass in burgers, and we will get back this array of burgers. And then we can use that to display. All right, so back in recipe selection VC, let us set this recipe's variable equal to the data set that we get back from the get recipes function. So I'm going to say recipes is equal to data dot get recipes for category, and we are going to pass in the selected category that we receive from our home VC. So now, depending on which one we click on, this variable is going to hold any of these arrays. Okay, so if we click on burgers, then that recipes variable now holds all of this information. If we click on pasta, it holds all of this information. So now what we can do is we can give back to the collection view the information that it needs for this delegate method, which is how many items are in the section. So we can say return recipes dot count. Okay. Now then we have this familiar function, cell for item at, and the process is the same as we did for a table view. And if you recall, we're going to need a reuse identifier, and I don't think I've set that up yet. So I'm going to go to our storyboard here and select our recipe cell, come over to its attributes inspector and give it a reuse identifier. We're going to call it recipe cell. Okay. And then back in recipes selection VC, let's go ahead and get our cell. So I'm going to say if let cell is equal to collection view dot, and we are going to dequeue a reusable cell with a reuse identifier, which we just gave it, which is recipe cell, and for index path. And remember, this is going to return a generic UI collection view cell, so we need to cast it as a recipe cell. Okay, so if we are able to get a dequeued cell and cast it as a recipe cell, we now have the configure cell function. And just to make this a little bit more clear, I'm going to create a intermediate variable here called a recipe is equal to recipes. So we are going to get our array of recipes and access the one that we need by saying index path dot item. Okay, and then we can pass in a recipe right here. And then for each cell that is dequeued and reused, we call the configure cell function. We pass in the recipe that corresponds to this index path dot item, which then passes that recipe here to our recipe cell, which then sets the image for that cell. And once we do all of that, then we return that cell. And if for whatever reason we were unsuccessful at either dequeuing a reusable cell or casting it as a recipe cell, we will return a generic UI collection view cell. All right, so this should be enough to test this. So let's go ahead and run it. All right, so let's go ahead and click on one of these. I'm going to click on salads. And, ooh, hey, there we go. We are actually seeing stuff. There's obviously some work that we need to do, so let's go ahead and do that. So one of the things here is that we set specific size of 150 by 150, and that's what it's showing us. But depending on your device width, that might not look great. You might have, for instance, with this, an iPhone 8, we have a lot of extra space in here that we could use to actually make these a little bit bigger and make the spacing more uniform. So what we're going to do is we are going to dynamically determine the size that we want our cells to be. And so for that, we need to use a method from our CollectionView delegate flow layout. In fact, let's go ahead and take a look at this. I'm going to command click and say jump to definition. And here we can see some of these methods. We have size for item at index path. That's probably the one that we want. We also have things like inset for section at, minimum line spacing, reference size for header in section, and more, okay? So this is the one that we want though, size for item at, okay? So when we are dequeuing and reusing cells, we are going to use, let's see here, size for item at, there we go. This is the one that we need. We need to return a CG size, okay? Now we want the cells to fill up the width of the device when we're in portrait mode. So what we want to do is we want to measure the width of the device, divide that in half, and make that the width and height for each of these cells, okay? So let's go ahead and figure out how to do that. First, we're going to need to know the width of the device that is being run on. So I'm going to say let width is equal to, and we can do that by saying view, which is the view of this view controller. Then we say bounds, which is the bounds rectangle. It describes the view's location and size in its own coordinate system. And then we can say dot width, okay? So this is the width of whatever device we run this application on. Then we can create a cell dimension variable, and this is going to be equal to the width divided by 2 minus 15, okay? So why are we doing this minus 15? This is going to account for padding, for spacing between the cells. And then we just need to return a CG size, and we'll initialize that with, let's see here, doubles, we'll say cell dimension and cell dimension. Okay, so what is this CG size thing? If you haven't seen it yet, it is simply a structure that contains width and height values, okay? So it makes sense that this method, size for item at, which is wanting to know the size to make a cell that has a width and a height, would expect us to return it in a CG size, which is simply a structure that contains width and height values. So all we have to do is initialize it with a width and a height and return that to the collection view so that it knows how to present the cells. All right, and then one other thing that I saw, we need to come into our storyboard, and I think we need to do clip to bounds on our image view because we weren't seeing our rounded corners. So I'm gonna say clip to bounds. And then another thing, interestingly, collection views are not by default set to be user interaction enabled. So if I ran this again and we had it set up to be able to segue to another view controller, it wouldn't work until we checked this. So we need to check user interaction enabled. And while we're here, we can give this a dummy image just to make it look good while we're in here. And let's go ahead and run that and see if our fixes made it all better. Alrighty, gonna select pasta this time, and ooh, there we go. That looks beautiful. All right, very, very nice. We can go back, select sandwiches. That looks good. Oh, I noticed something else. You can see that this one doesn't look quite right. It looks a little bit squished, which tells me that we forgot to set the content mode to be aspect fill. There we go. All right, there we go. That looks better. All right, so now what we want to do is be able to click on one of these and pass the selected recipe to our final view controller where we are going to display the instructions and a larger image of the food item, all right? So we're gonna do that in the next and final lesson, so I'll see you there.